Okay, so just to repeat, you've got the stupid Hayden Edwards Republic of Fredonia silliness in early 1827. Mexico City freaks out. They send Tehran an expedition to kind of spy on Texas as well as explore the natural world of Texas. Tehran goes back to Mexico City and he writes a report saying to his superiors, "You better act now or Texas will be lost forever." That's actually a direct quote. You better, Mexico City needs to try to reassert its control over Mexican Texas because especially the eastern part of Mexican Texas is more American than it is Mexican. By the way, Tehran has comes to a very sad end. Um, I think he clearly saw that Texas would ultimately be lost to Mexico, which of course is what happened. And I think we forget, from the point of view of the United States, we forget what a tragedy it is that Mexico lost Texas. It was a real tragedy for the Mexican nation. And so Tehran sees this. He sees what's happening, and ultimately, we don't know why he did this, but he ultimately, after he writes his report, he puts on his uniform and he goes and he kills himself. And no one really knows why anyone commits suicide, but there is a lot of speculation that he killed himself because he saw what the future held. And what the future held was is that Mexico would lose Texas, which again, from the point of view of Mexico, is quite a tragic moment in the history of Mexico. So then now so now Mexico City's starting to think, okay, we've got a problem in Texas. We've got to reassert our control. In all this, out of the blue, the president of Mexico in 1829, and this is something that I'm going to test you on. Out of the blue, the president of Mexico, a man by the name of Vicente Guerrero, he abolishes slavery. He just signs a document abolishing slavery. And again, this wasn't a big deal in Mexico because except for the Northeast, except for Mexican Texas and some politicians in Saltillo, Mexico was overwhelmingly anti-slavery. So when Guerrero abolishes slavery, it's not a controversial act at all within most of Mexico. Although, of course, in Anglo-Texas, people freak out. Now, Guerrero is very interesting. Guerrero was himself of African descent. He would have been considered African American had he lived in the United States. We're not sure why he abolished slavery in Mexico, what was behind it. But again, honestly, it really wasn't that big a deal in the Mexican context because slavery really wasn't that big a deal in Mexico, except for Mexican Texas. Now, there's some complications. Anyway, what this does is the news that Guerrero's abolished slavery, it goes to San Antonio first. That's the kind of capital of Mexican Texas, and San Antonio is still very, very much Tejano. It's still very much, it's a century old. It's not East Texas, and also you don't have cotton grown in San Antonio because there's not enough water. There's not enough rain. And so the Mexican governor in San Antonio gets news of this and he keeps it secret because he knows that if Anglos hear about this, that there's going to be maybe a major rebellion. And what he does is he issues an urgent plea to Mexico City, and he asks that Texans, the Anglo-Texans, be allowed to continue owning slaves. He wants Texas, the abolition of slavery in Mexico. He doesn't want it to apply to Texas. And Mexico City agrees with him. And so what Guerrero does doesn't initially apply to Texas, but it's a warning shot to Anglo-Texans who are all pro-slavery. It's a warning shot about the anti-slavery feeling in really most of Mexico. And it's the other thing is it discourages other Americans from bringing their slaves into Mexican Texas. It's just too risky for that. This is why more Americans could have come into Texas in the 1820s. But what stops them from coming in, they just don't trust Mexico City. They just think that slavery isn't safe in Mexico. So the abolition of slavery in 1829 doesn't really apply to Texas. The Mexican governor of Texas is able to um, uh, uh, stop, the implementation of abolition of slaves in Texas, but it's definitely a warning shot. Now, though, the Mexico City lowers the boom on Texas just a year later. And what Mexico City does, it passes the law of April 6th, 1830. And believe me, I know that when I say the law of April 6th, 1830, that is the kind of thing that makes people hate history. What could be more boring than the words, the law of April 6th, 1830, right? It's like mind numbing, but you have to know it. So you have to suck it up because this is the great accelerator of Texas towards revolution and breaking from Mexico City. So one of the nice things about the law of April 6th, 1830, at least you know what the date is. And again, remember, it's the context of the Edwards Rebellion, Fredonia, Tehran's report, act now or Texas will be lost forever. So the law of April 6th, 1830 is a response to the Tehran, the very alarmed report by Tehran about the situation in Texas and how Texas was, especially East Texas, was more American than it was Mexican. So it's the key moment on the road to the Texas Revolution. It's passed by the Mexican National Congress. So I've talked a lot in these earlier podcasts about how a lot of the power was in Saltillo, but now Mexico City is starting to assert its authority over Texas because Texas has just become it's just become too independent from Mexico City. So now Mexico City is trumping Saltillo. The centralists now are gaining the upper hand in Mexico City, and they're demanding that the central government in Mexico City intervene in Texas and try to regain or reassert the authority of the Mexican national government over Texas. So the law of April 6th, 1830, it comes from the federal government. And now we're starting to see the Mexican national government assert itself in Texas, or at least try to assert itself in Texas. So what the law does and what's significant about it is that it forbids, after a brief period of time, Austin is allowed to complete his contract. He had signed off on, I think, 1,600 families, and there were still a couple hundred families that had not come into to Mexican Texas. He was allowed to complete his contract. Other impresarios were too. But after the completion of these contracts, immigration from the United States was shut down. It was closed. The law of April 6th, 1830 shuts down immigration from the United States after the impresario contracts are fulfilled. Okay, so that is a pretty big deal, right? Mexico is saying, uh-oh, we've made a big mistake. We've let the fox into the hen house. And we're just going to we made a big mistake by letting Anglo-Americans come into Texas. We're losing control over Texas, and we're shutting the door to the United States. Now, it's easier said than done right? As I said in the earlier podcast, Mexico City's very weak. It doesn't have a strong police force or military presence in Mexican Texas. And so people, Anglo Americans, are still coming into Texas um, after this law is passed because the Mexican government's too weak to really stop them. And so, really, the first kind of undocumented workers or undocumented that come into Texas are really the Anglo Americans who come into Texas after the law of April 6th, 1830 is passed. So, immigration, number one, immigration shut down. The other thing is that slavery will be declared illegal in Texas. So what the law of April 6th, 1830, it's a double-barreled assault on Anglo-Texans. Number one, no more immigration from the United States, no more apprentice laws. That doesn't apply anymore, and that it calls for an end to slavery. So a very, very, very significant moment in the history of Mexican Texas. What you have here is an attempt by the Mexican central government to regain control over its northeastern province that borders the United States, which is Texas. No more slaves into Texas, no more Anglos into Texas, just immigration has stopped. Um, well, the Anglo-Texans are furious when they get news of this law. They feel like it's a betrayal. And they also feel, and this is where this gets involved with Mexican politics, they feel like it's a betrayal of Mexican federalism. Remember, supposedly it was Saltillo who was supposed to run affairs in Texas, not Mexico City. But with the law of April 6th, 1830, now Mexico City is trying to run the show in Texas. So Anglo-Texans are mad at Mexico because they feel like the law of April 6th, 1830 is subverting federalism, which puts the power in the state government, not the national government. So the Anglos in Texas, they oppose the law of April 6th, 1830s on grounds that have to do with Mexican politics. So Anglo Americans have become federalist. They want power to be in Saltillo. They don't want it to be in Mexico City. And they say, okay, how can you pass the law of April 6th, 1830? That's Mexico City running the show. When you told us in the Constitution of 1824 that Saltillo would be running the show. So suddenly now, Anglos, pro-slavery Anglos, like such as Stephen F. Austin, they're complaining that federalism is being subverted by the law of April 6th, 1830, and that the centralists in Mexico City are now running the show. And they think that this is a violation of Mexican law. They also demand that Texas be allowed to be a standalone state. Anglos want Texas to be an independent state separate from Coahuila. Saltillo is just too far away. And so Anglo-Texans, they feel like they don't have enough power within the Mexican nation, and they want to be a separate state. They want to be a separate slave state as well. So this is a huge issue among Anglos in Texas as well. They want Texas to be a separate standalone state. And they want Texas to be ruled on federalist grounds. They want Texas to be ruled by Texans. They don't want Texas to be ruled by Mexico City. So this is how the run up to the Mexican Revolution gets tied up in Mexican politics, because the pro-slavery Anglos in Texas, and almost all the Anglos in Texas were pro-slavery. They're federalists. They want Texas to be a standalone state, and they want the chance to run their own affairs. In other words, they want slavery. They want slavery to exist in Texas. And they also want to pass laws allowing immigration from the United States into Texas. Well, For Mexico City, this is an absolute no-go. Mexico City has no interest whatsoever in creating a separate Texas that is run under the federalist system, where Anglos basically are running the show. Mexico City just has zero interest in creating a separate Texas that's run by a federalist state government that basically does what it pleases. Uh, this is just not going to happen. This is just not going to happen. And so this is where federalism and centralism get tied up into the question of slavery, because the centralists in Mexico City are basically anti-slavery, right? Because most of Mexico is anti-slavery, and they're trying to reassert their control in Texas. Well, the Federalists, and most of the Anglos in Texas are Federalists, and also those in Saltillo, they want power to be on the local level. They want Texas to be a standalone state run under a federalist system where the Anglos in Texas basically run the show in Texas themselves. And Mexico has very little say in how Texas would be run. And of course, what that meant for Texas is unfettered slavery. The future of slavery would be guaranteed. If Texas is created as a standalone state and Texas can run its own affairs, Anglos dominate in Texas at this period, and slavery would have thrived. But it was a fantasy. Mexico City would never let Texas be a standalone state and would never let Anglo-Texans create a federalist system in Texas in which Texas basically did what it wanted with very little say from Mexico City. So what you have now is the divide between Anglo-Texans and Mexico City on the question of federalism versus centralism. Again, Texas wants to be a standalone state, a federalist state. They run their own affairs. Mexico City says no, absolutely not. We are running Mexico City. The national government is running the affairs in Texas. The Texans cannot run their own affairs. Now, there were other states in Mexico that also wanted to be federalist as well, but that's not part of our story. The big thing was they didn't border the United States and they didn't have slaves. So this is how the question of slavery in Texas gets tied up into the fight in Mexico between the Federalist and the Centralist. So again, so what you've got this fight, and Texans are angry at Stephen F. Austin. They think that Austin has blown it for them. And you start having rumblings in Texas about breaking from Mexico. And there's a meeting in 1833 of Anglo-Texans, and they send Stephen F. Austin to Mexico City. And they say to Stephen F. Austin, you've got to persuade Mexico City to rescind the law of April 6, 1830, to allow immigration from the United States again, to allow slaves into Mexican Texas. You've got to persuade Mexico City to allow Texas to be a standalone state, a federalist state in which Anglo-Texans run the affairs, their own affairs. And so Austin goes to Mexico City. He's under a lot of pressure because he's become very unpopular among most Anglos because they're very angry about how Mexico City's trying to assert its control over Mexico City. So they send Stephen F. Austin down to Mexico City to try to present their case to the government in Mexico City. Mexico City refuses to do anything that the Texans ask of them. On his way back to Texas, Austin does something that's kind of dumb. He writes a letter, and in this letter, he says, Texas should declare itself an independent state within Mexico, just unilaterally. So Austin isn't calling for Texas to become an independent republic. He's saying the Texans should just say, hey, we're an independent state within Mexico. And they should just declare their independence within Mexico as a state. So it's not a revolution yet. So Mexico City, they're spying on Austin. They get a hold of this letter and they throw him in jail. So Stephen F. Austin is thrown in jail for about a year after he writes this letter demanding that Texas become a standalone state within Mexico, a federalist state that can run its own affairs. And that's where I'm going to leave you today. Stephen F. Austin is in jail, and there's quite a bit of upset in Anglo Texas about how Mexico City, the central government, is starting to try to assert its control in Mexican Texas.